What's going on?
Oh, not a whole lot. Just slept in today, actually. It was kind of nice to get a little bit extra rest. I think just sort of building up the fatigue. What about you?
I did the exact opposite. I woke up at 4:30.
There you go. The old Jocko Willing style.
I didn't post a picture of my watch, though.
That's okay. I'm pretty sure he just like resets his watch anyways, takes a photo, and then goes back to bed.
I
So
don't know. He looks like a pretty weird dude.
no, I don't doubt that he does that shit. My brother was super fucking militant as well. Like he'd always make us have cold showers when we were growing up to like make you mentally tough and shit. So like no hot water, eat raw meat, don't be a bitch.
Yeah, the raw meat. Salmonella is not cool.
No, but I mean that being said, now I never get stomach issues from food because I can eat whatever the fuck I want. So it's not recommended. But we're getting a couple people joining in here. So what's going on to everyone who's joining us? Right now I'm live with Paul Oneid, and we're going to be talking about training with reps. So first off, Paul, thanks for jumping on, man. This is my first Instagram live. Never done one before, so hopefully this works out. Can you give a little bit of a background of who you are?
Sure, I'm Paul Oneid. I'm the head coach at Master Athletic Performance with my co-coaches Olivia Michaud and Nat Galloway. I also am the co-owner of Coaches Corner University, which is a continuing education platform for coaches that provides, we bridge the gap between the experimental and the experiential evidence-based practice. And I'm also a mentor. So I mentor young coaches looking to build their businesses and improve their work-life balance. So we do a lot of things. I've also competed in powerlifting for the last 13 years, totaled 1960 at 242, 1900 at 220, and I've squatted over 800 about 14 times. So I know a little bit about squatting and reps and hoping to help out and provide some information in that regard.
Awesome, man. So I guess we may as well just dive right into it. So when someone's looking to get started in training and reps, first of all, do you think there is a sort of base level of strength and experience that needs to be achieved prior to getting into reps and some of the more equipped type training?
Yes and no. You're going to have the requisite amount of technical proficiency to squat and reps. It is a skill in and of itself to not allow the rep to push you around. That being said, when I squatted 800 for the first time, the heaviest I had ever attempted in sleeves was 585. So you don't necessarily have to squat heavy in sleeves to be able to squat heavy in reps. I would say the more important factor there is technical proficiency. If you are going to be competing in reps, you'll have to practice in reps. So that's just about it. It's just how you organize your training, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. So wait, your heaviest squat was 585, but was that was below what you were capable of that time, and then you hit over 7?
I squatted 800, and the most I'd ever attempted in sleeves was 585. Yeah, it was a sub-maximal lift. But
Okay,
anytime I would train in reps, I would just hit 585 for a single and then put my reps on. So there was no reason for me to squat in sleeves higher than that because that wasn't what I was trying to compete in.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And so when someone is looking to transition, like what are some of the strategies that you implement regarding the frequency of using reps, the intensity, the loading structure, the warm-ups? Even just right now, you were talking about how you would warm up in sleeves and then switch to reps at a certain level. So can you kind of give a general breakdown of how that looks?
Absolutely. So the way in which I would implement the reps training is typically around 80% of 1 rep max. So that's going to be a lift where when you put the reps on should be significantly easier, but is heavy enough that you still have to groove the lift properly. So you still have to put some effort into it. So triples at 80% is usually my entry point for rep training. So it's a weight you're not going to miss, and you can focus on the execution. From there, I would implement some RPE style of training where we are pushing for, RPE 8s in that 3 to 5 range. I also love putting in paused squatting with reps on because it teaches lifters how to find depth. That's probably the hardest thing to do in knee reps is find your depth. So I would implement some submaximal pauses while wearing the wraps. The other thing that'll help with is getting used to how uncomfortable the wraps are. That's the biggest complaint from people who implement wraps into their training is they hurt. They're also not used to the amount of tension created in the knee during the squat with a tight wrap. It's actually hilarious to me when I get to wrap a lifter for the first time and I'll give them a light wrap and they're like, oh my God, I'm dying. And they think they're going to get their leg cut off. Meanwhile, I could probably get a couple more revolutions to it. But at the beginning, I would say once a week, squatting in wraps is plenty. As you get more proficient, I would actually reduce the frequency that you squat in wraps because of the amount of fatigue built up from supramaximal training. But once a week, 1 or 2 top sets, 1 or 2 down sets. You want to try and mimic meet conditions. So in a meet, you would typically take 5 attempts in wraps. So you would do your warm-ups and take 2 warm-ups in wraps before your opener. So you should approach your training in that same manner. Whereas, say you have 3 working sets in that workout, your last 2 warm-ups into those working sets should be in wraps.
Mm-hmm. And so that's to kind of get comfortable with the groove and then also not generate too much. Well, yeah, no, never mind. That makes sense. Okay, yeah, cool. And so when you are starting, you mentioned that you wrap a little bit looser. How do you know how to kind of gauge the tension and how to scale that, like, let's say from week 1, week 2, things like that?
Oh, I don't. You should be wrapping your knee wraps as tight as you can always.
Oh, even from the very get-go?
Yeah, why would you wrap them loose?
I don't know. No, I just mean like to introduce someone, because I know I was talking to Mitch the other day, and Leah, you probably don't know Leah, but she's from the Strength Edge.
Yeah, I know.
And okay, yeah, so she's competing in wraps at Shell Shock, and he was just giving her like a light wrap so she could kind of get a feel for it. I wasn't sure if that was like maybe a thing. I've never squatted in wraps, so I don't know.
In my opinion, there's no reason to squat in a light wrap. In that a tight wrap feels completely different.
Mm-hmm.
So why would you squat in something that isn't going to teach you how to squat, right? Like practice how you play kind of thing?
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense.
In your warm-ups, I might temper, like, you know, for example, if my working set's in the mid-set, I'm not going to wrap my knees to that level of tightness with 600 on the bar because I won't be able to hit depth. Mm-hmm. But for my working sets, every set is as tight as I can get it.
Yeah. No, that's fair. That makes sense. And is there a particular direction that you actually end up wrapping? Because I know I've seen people say, 1, doesn't matter. 2, I've seen people say you wrap out. I've seen people say you wrap in. What are your thoughts on that?
I typically will wrap out just because most people will, like, essentially what you're doing is you're introducing attention to the patella. So if anything, I want my patella to default out rather than in terms of the line with the quadricep. I've never heard of people preferring to wrap in, but I have heard of people not giving a shit. Personally, I used to be one of those. I would always just wrap to the right. But then I started doing both knees out. It's just a personal preference type of thing. For most people, it won't matter most of the time.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fair. Okay. And one of the questions that I think someone sent you was, let me see if I can pull it up here.
It was about calf pain.
Yeah. How do you prevent calf and hamstring injuries when squatting in wraps?
Okay, so those injuries will happen if you do not wrap the knee with a locked knee and dorsiflexed ankle. So what you're essentially doing with that wrap is you're applying pressure to the muscle around the knee. So if you wrap with a shortened hamstring or a bent knee, and then you stretch it under a tensile strength, you're essentially doing ART on your hamstring under maximal loads. Same thing with the calf. If you don't dorsiflex the ankle, you're going to tack that calf down in a shortened position. So then it's overstretching in the bottom. So when you wrap the knee, you want to flex your quad as hard as you can, and you want to dorsiflex the ankle, and you want to keep it that way throughout. That way, the muscles are tacked down in a more lengthened position, and you won't have that issue. The other thing that people kind of are oblivious to is there's this wrap style where you tie a knot on top of the knee. Well, if you're tying a knot on top of the knee and the quad is flexed, i.e. in a shortened position, and then you put it under load in a lengthened position with a tack on it, if you look at 99% of the quad tears that occur when lifting in wraps, it's with the style where there's a tie on top of the quad.
That's interesting.
Local pressure point on that quad tendon, when you stretch it under load with that pressure point, you're essentially, again, doing loaded ART on your quad. It's going to snap.
So how do you, when you say like a knot, are you talking about like
they leave a tab as they wrap, and then they finish the wrap by bringing it back up and tying a knot.
I don't know that I've ever seen that. No, I have seen that. Yes, you're right.
Seth Albersworth does it. I think it's. I love Seth to death. That's stupid.
Yeah, I've normally seen people. I mean, I haven't trained with too many people who do use knee wraps. Like I've trained with Brad and JC for when I was down in Ontario for a while. But he just kind of used that, like he'd use the pliers and pull it through, and so it's just kind of like overlay. And so that's mostly what I've seen. But so in terms of training with wraps, what sort of additional considerations might you look at outside of just the squat? So obviously, if you're doing higher intensity sets, fatigue might accumulate and kind of bleed into other training sessions.
Right. So you're going to want to remember that squatting in wraps is going to be supra-maximal. You're either going to be able to handle heavier loads or be able to perform more repetitions with maximal loads. So that will bleed in a couple of ways. Number one, the chest and shoulders and elbows are going to get a little bit more beat up because they're supporting more load in that rack position. The other thing is the lower back is going to get more fatigue because you have to hold your posture. And number three is going to be a little bit of adductor. This is something most people don't really think about, but because you're tacking down the musculature around the knee, that adductor is going to get a little bit more work. So what you're going to want to do is monitor your recovery into your deadlifts and monitor your recovery session to session of your bench press. Because if you are a lifter prone to elbow tendonitis during prep, you might have to adjust your bench training accordingly, maybe putting a rest day between benching and squatting, maybe putting your bench prior to your squats, just to get that heavy pressing away from the squats. The other thing would be, I have a lot of lifters who will go more so like a heavy, light weekly rotation. So they'll do a maximal single or double, and then the down week, they'll do triples at a submaximal load. That week where they do the triples at a submaximal load, they would do their heavy deadlifting, and on the weeks they go heavy on the squat, they would go lighter on the deadlift.
That makes sense. And so when you're talking about exposures, I know you talked about, starting out at about 80% and then eventually gradually moving a little higher, doing sets of 3 to 5. So in terms of how many total, let's say, work sets, do you have any sort of guidelines in terms of total work sets? And then also, would there be some additional sort of constraints that you'd place around how high you go in repetitions?
Well, doing more than 5 reps in wraps is just going to be miserable. So I usually don't do more than 5. 5's like the cutoff for me. In terms of working sets, I keep it at 3 because that's going to mimic a meet, right? So we're going to do 2 of our warm-ups and then 3 working sets. So 5 total sets in the wraps. You have to remember too that the skin around the knees has to get used to wearing the wraps. You might get like a rash or a burn or even bruising from the wraps. So you'll need to recover from that. And we don't want to do too much volume in them. So that 3 working set mark tends to be the happy point for me and my lifters. Then from there, looking at, we'll probably keep it 3s and 5s and then start introducing some submaximal singles, escalating to maybe attempting something under a second attempt and blowing it up. I'm not a believer in maxing out in the gym when it comes to reps training because it's just so stressful in the system, for the reasons we discussed earlier. So that's kind of how I would temper it into the training. Some escalating singles, down weeks would be submaximal triples or doubles, and then slowly just increasing the exposure to heavier loads as we get closer to the meet. The other thing you might realize is that because they're super maximal loads, you might have to taper longer. So your taper might actually be, 21 days or, 28 days in some cases, depending on how strong the person is, head meet. So you might take your heaviest squat, 3 or 4 weeks out, and then maybe an opener the next week, and then a really big deload, and then an even bigger deload the next week, so you can come in fresh and decay all that fatigue.
Mm-hmm. And so regarding exercise variation, is there anything that you might maybe do differently? Because so for instance, if we're doing squats, like you said, your back is going to be beat up a lot more because you're handling heavier loads. Your shoulders might take a lot more. And so we talked a little bit about how to adjust the rest of your kind of training. But in terms of, let's say, exercise selection, does that maybe change at all? Or do you kind of keep it the same, like for accessories and auxiliary movements?
If you're doing any auxiliary squatting, I would use a safety bar or a buffalo bar, something to take the strain off the shoulders a little bit. But in terms of like assistance work, I would absolutely continue to have, some bicep curls in that shortened position, some tricep curls, some tricep extensions in that lengthened position, making sure to stay active through that scapular range to be able to access those positions of external rotation under load. That's going to be really, really helpful there. Making sure that we're training the lengthened position of the pec so that we have access to that range there as well, and doing everything that we can to maintain our external rotation through the shoulder. That's where that's where the main considerations will be. But realistically, if you have good programming, those should be in there all the time anyway.
Mm-hmm. And are there any additional considerations in terms of like loading into the calves? Like I've never had any issues squatting, but I think there's been maybe one time, so it is pretty rare, obviously, where like the calves actually were for this person kind of like a rate limiter. Like they were so weak that they couldn't stabilize in the bottom of the squat. So I had them doing a little bit of calf press, and then it was fine. So it was like 2 weeks. But
I'm guessing that person was wrapping incorrectly and not dorsiflexing the ankle, and I'm guessing that they were wearing a heeled shoe.
They were wearing heeled shoes, yeah. No, they were not wrapped. They were raw squatter. That's what I was saying. It was like really, really rare. I've only seen it the once, but it was another question that kind of came in here as well. For like
the only time I've heard that was if the person was in a heeled shoe and they were handling some like super maximal loads. If they're not rooting through the floor properly and they're shifting to the toes too much, yeah, you might have that. And you did the right thing. Just train that position in which they're having issues with, and then move on.
Fair enough. Awesome, man. So we're kind of coming up on the end here. I wanted to keep these, about 20 minutes or so. Sure. Where can people find you, and are there any projects that you're working on or launching at the moment?
So people can find me on Instagram here at Paul Oneid or at www.masterathletic.com. Big projects right now are our Coach's Corner course is launching September 12th, so that's up for registration. So at Coach's Corner U or www.coachescorneru.com. We have it's a 10-hour pre-recorded course, so you take it at your own pace, and we have weekly live lectures on Tuesday nights. With regards to personally, really working hard to build my mentorship clientele. That's where I'm primarily focusing my attention. And then with regards to our company, Olivia and Nat are accepting new clients. And if you are interested and think you'd be a good fit, we are looking to take on another coach as well in the next little bit. So let us know.
Awesome. So all that stuff's going to be linked up in the show notes, guys, because this is going on YouTube as well. So definitely make sure you go and check them out. Paul, thanks so much for jumping on, man. It was cool to chat.
My pleasure, man. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks. Bye.